When you finally lock the door, put up the absolute boundary, and disappear into prolonged no contact, you aren't just giving them space, you are starving an ego that believes it owns your soul. And what they do behind closed doors, when the supply completely stops, will terrify you. Most people think silence means they've simply forgotten about you. Oh no. The reality of what happens in a narcissist's mind after months of absolute zero communication is a dark descent into panic, surveillance, and a desperate, calculated hunt for a new mirror. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. If you have ever stayed silent for weeks or months, wondering if they even notice you're gone, or if you're dreading the day they suddenly pop back up out of nowhere, you are not alone. This is one of the most anxiety-inducing phases of healing because even though you can't see them, you can feel the heavy shadow they left behind. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on the psychology of prolonged no contact. We are looking at the exact, predictable stages a narcissistic individual goes through when you starve them of your reactions, your empathy, and your presence. When a person successfully maintains prolonged no contact with a narcissist, the immediate psychological aftermath for the individual with narcissistic traits is not standard grief or healthy sorrow, but rather a catastrophic internal crisis known as a narcissistic injury. Because their entire identity is built upon an unstable foundation of external validation, grandiosity, and a fragile ego, they rely completely on their victims to act as an emotional mirror, regulating their self-esteem and confirming their perceived superiority. When that supply line is entirely severed through prolonged silence, it triggers a profound system shock that destabilizes their internal world. To understand why this happens, it is essential to recognize that the narcissist does not perceive their victim as a separate, autonomous human being with independent rights, feelings, and boundaries. Instead, the victim is viewed as an extension of the narcissist themselves, a functional object meant to provide continuous adoration, compliance, and emotional fuel. Therefore, when you enact prolonged no contact, your absence is not processed as a healthy boundary-setting measure or a personal choice. To the narcissist, it is experienced as an intolerable abandonment and a direct assault on their core identity. In the initial stages of this cutoff, the narcissist typically assumes the silence is merely a temporary tactic, a theatrical negotiation tool, or a fleeting emotional reaction that they will eventually outlast through patience or minor intimidation. However, as weeks bleed into months and the absolute zero communication holds firm, a creeping, desperate panic begins to take over. Their internal machinery, which is entirely dependent on manipulating your reactions to feel powerful and secure, suddenly grinds to a halt. Deprived of the ability to provoke a response, watch you crumble, or feed off your emotional turbulence, they find themselves staring into a terrifying emotional void. This panic forces them into a state of acute ego instability. Without your continuous supply, they are forced to confront the hidden, deeply repressed feelings of inadequacy, shame, and emptiness that they spend their entire lives running away from. Because their psychological defenses cannot tolerate admitting fault or experiencing genuine vulnerability, this terror quickly morphs into explosive internal rage and cognitive distortion. They desperately begin looking for ways to restore equilibrium, whether through covert surveillance, smear campaigns, or eventual attempts to hoover you back into their sphere of influence. Ultimately, the panic of lost control exposes just how hollow their grandiosity truly is, revealing that your silence is the most powerful weapon you possess because it forces them to confront the very emptiness they tried to inflict upon you. When a narcissist is cut off by prolonged no contact, the initial panic of lost control quickly evolves into a calculated, covert phase of behavioral observation, often referred to as the watcher phase or silent surveillance. Because their ego refuses to accept outright defeat or permanent rejection, they cannot simply walk away without gathering intelligence. They need to assess the threat level of your absence and find out whether you are truly gone or if your defenses are vulnerable. Since direct communication has been blocked, they resort to stealthy, indirect methods to keep tabs on your life, transforming themselves into digital and social ghosts. During this phase, they meticulously comb through your digital footprint. Even if they are blocked on your primary accounts, they will often utilize secondary burner profiles, alternative social media platforms, or mutual acquaintances to monitor your movements. They are looking for any piece of evidence, a change in your job status, a new photo, a casual comment from a friend that might reveal how you are coping without them. If you post that you are happy, thriving, or moving on, it inflicts a massive narcissistic injury, proving that you do not need them to survive. Conversely, if they sense any hint of vulnerability, hardship, or sadness, it feeds their grandiose fantasy that you are still anchored to their orbit, waiting for their return. Importantly, this surveillance is entirely devoid of genuine care, affection, or remorse. A normal person checks in on an ex out of a sense of shared history or residual warmth, but the narcissist is purely hunting for leverage and narcissistic supply. They are looking for a crack in your armor, a sign of weakness they can exploit, or proof that you are suffering because of their absence. This quiet observation allows them to protect their fragile pride while secretly plotting their next move. By staying entirely off their radar and refusing to feed this silent monitoring with any emotional reaction, you starve their surveillance engine, eventually forcing them to realize that their window of influence has permanently closed. When prolonged, no contact completely strips away a narcissist's access to their primary source of emotional supply, their fragile, grandiose ego faces an existential threat that it cannot possibly handle. To protect themselves from experiencing agonizing shame, deep-seated inadequacy, or the terrifying reality that their toxic behavior drove you away, their psyche immediately triggers a powerful defense mechanism known as narrative rewriting. This is not merely a deliberate, conscious lie they tell others, though it certainly manifests as that. It is an internal psychological restructuring where they genuinely convince themselves that a completely fabricated version of reality is the absolute truth. In this rewritten history, the roles of victim and perpetrator are entirely inverted. The narcissist erases all the manipulation, psychological abuse, gaslighting, and boundary violations they inflicted upon you, replacing them with a narrative that casts them as the long-suffering, deeply misunderstood victim of your coldness, cruelty, and irrationality. To anyone who will listen, mutual friends, family members, or new acquaintances, they spin a compelling, highly rehearsed tragedy about how hard they tried to make the relationship work, only to be abandoned or mistreated by someone who was supposedly ungrateful or unstable. By casting themselves in this sympathetic light, they protect their fragile self-image from the devastating crack of accountability. This distortion is entirely necessary for their psychological survival, because acknowledging the truth would mean facing their own deeply repressed flaws and emotional failures, which their ego cannot tolerate. Furthermore, this rewritten narrative serves a dual purpose by laying the groundwork for future smear campaigns and social manipulation. When they convince others that they were the injured party, they effectively weaponize your absence against you, turning your protective boundary into proof of your alleged wrongdoing. By understanding this mechanism, you realize that their version of events has nothing to do with who you are or what actually happened, and everything to do with their desperate, ongoing need to preserve a flawless self-image in a world that is slowly seeing right through them. When prolonged no contact continues unbroken, a narcissist eventually reaches a tipping point where passive surveillance and internal narrative rewriting fail to soothe their ego. Realizing that their power over you is evaporating, they enter a highly volatile stage characterized by escalation, testing, and narcissistic rage. In behavioral psychology, this sudden, intense spike in toxic behavior is akin to an extinction burst, a desperate, heightened effort to regain a reward that has been completely withdrawn. Because silence denies them the emotional fuel they desperately require, they escalate their tactics to deliberately force an emotional reaction, knowing that if they can make you angry, defensive, or upset, they still exert control over your internal state. This escalation manifests through several calculated high-pressure maneuvers. First, they engage in test phases, sending cryptic messages, leaving forgotten items on your doorstep, or creating emergencies through mutual acquaintances to see if you will break character. When these subtle probes fail, the rage turns outward into aggressive smear campaigns. They begin systematically spreading lies, twisting past confidences, and assassinating your character to anyone who will listen, attempting to destroy your reputation before you can reveal the truth about them. They recruit flying monkeys, enablers, mutual friends, or family members to do their dirty work, sending third parties to guilt trip you, report back on your life, or pressure you into breaking your boundary. If direct access remains completely blocked, the indirect provocations become increasingly petty and targeted. They might publicly parade a new partner, make passive-aggressive posts on social media tailored specifically to trigger your deepest insecurities, or deliberately interfere with your work or social environments. Every single one of these actions is a bid for attention. Positive or negative emotional engagement is seen as a victory because it proves to them that they still matter. Narcissistic rage during this period is not a sign of strength or genuine superiority, but a profound display of emotional dysregulation and helplessness. When their usual tools of charm, guilt, and fear fail to elicit a reaction. Their grandiosity crumbles into reactionary panic, driving them to escalate into calculated cruelty simply to prove to themselves that you are still watching. Before we map out this psychological blueprint, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. So many of you watching are deep in your healing journeys, and understanding these manipulation patterns is the absolute key to keeping your peace and never letting them pull you back into the chaos. Let's get into it. When a narcissist has exhausted all attempts at surveillance, narrative rewriting, and escalation, and still finds themselves completely frozen out by your prolonged no contact, they eventually shift into a long-term waiting pattern that frequently culminates in a delayed hoovering attempt. Weeks, months, or sometimes even years later, when you have deeply settled into your peace, rebuilt your nervous system, and nearly forgotten the chaos they once caused, a sudden, unexpected communication arrives out of nowhere. It might be a casual text message on a random Tuesday afternoon, a seemingly innocent comment on an old photograph, a fake question about a shared item, or a text claiming they just happened to think of you. These delayed hoovers are intentionally designed to look as low stakes, harmless, and casual as possible to lower your guard. The narcissist knows that if they came in hot with accusations, love bombing, or demands, your defensive walls would immediately shoot back up. Instead, they test the waters with a microscopic hook, probing to see if the door to your life is still unlocked. They might ask a trivial question, pretend to check in on a pet, or casually mention a memory, all while projecting an aura of total nonchalance. They are not reaching out because they miss you, value your character, or feel genuine remorse for the destruction they left behind. They are running an audit on your availability. Behind this casual outreach is a cold, calculated calculation regarding their current narcissistic supply inventory. Often, a delayed hoover happens because a secondary or tertiary source of supply has fallen through, a new relationship has fizzled out, or their ego is simply facing a sudden deficit. In that moment of internal starvation, their mind scrolls backward through past targets, looking for an easy, preconditioned mirror that once provided reliable validation. They re-engage because they believe the neural pathways of compliance they built with you are still active, assuming that your absence was just a temporary pause rather than a permanent boundary. Recognizing this pattern is vital for your continued healing because it strips away the romanticized illusions they try to project. When that unexpected message arrives, it is rarely a sign of growth or awakening on their part. It is simply a recycle attempt driven by an empty ego. Understanding that these delayed probes are inevitable allows you to maintain your psychological armor, view their outreach with objective detachment, and keep the door firmly bolted shut. By refusing to respond to the bait, you deny them the final satisfaction they seek, ensuring that their past attempts to control you remain nothing more than distant, powerless echoes. When a narcissist faces prolonged no contact and realizes their primary source of supply has been completely cut off, their immediate internal crisis requires a rapid-fire solution to prevent a total psychological collapse. Because their internal engine cannot function without a continuous influx of external validation, adoration, and emotional engagement, they cannot simply sit in a state of emptiness. To patch this sudden and severe narcissistic supply deficit, their behavior shifts toward emotional substitution, a process where they aggressively seek out replacement mirrors to stabilize their fragile ego. This involves casting a wide net to find secondary or tertiary sources of supply who can temporarily fill the vast chasm left by your absence. This substitution process is characterized by a frantic, opportunistic hunt. They may suddenly lean much harder into newer romantic prospects, elevate casual acquaintances into primary confidants, or seek out enablers and admirers on social media who are willing to offer unconditional praise without knowing their true history. If they are already in a relationship with a backup partner, that person will experience an intense, overwhelming surge of attention, often being love-bombed or idealized far beyond normal levels to compensate for the ego injury you inflicted. The narcissist treats people like interchangeable components in a machine. As long as the fuel keeps flowing, the specific identity of the supplier matters far less than the volume of validation they provide. However, these substitute sources rarely replicate the deep psychological conditioning they achieved with their primary target. A new supply or a secondary source has not yet been fully broken down, conditioned, or trained to tolerate high levels of manipulation and emotional turbulence. Consequently, these substitute relationships are often volatile, superficial, and short-lived. The narcissist may project a grand illusion of happiness and stability with their new replacements, often parading them publicly or posting heavily about them online specifically to make you think they are thriving. Yet, behind this facade, the substitution is merely a temporary patch on a gaping wound. It does not heal their internal void, which is why even the most heavily substituted narcissist will often circle back to old primary targets when their replacement sources inevitably fail to meet their bottomless destructive demands for control. When prolonged no contact holds firm and even their frantic attempts at emotional substitution fail to provide a lasting fix, the narcissist encounters a profound narcissistic injury that forces them into a deeply defensive posture. If their covert surveillance yields zero results, your life continues to improve, and alternative sources of supply dry up or fall short, their fragile ego cannot handle the raw, unadulterated shame of rejection. To mask this agonizing internal collapse and protect their grandiose self-image from shattering completely, they project a powerful, calculated illusion of supreme apathy. They adopt a persona of absolute indifference, acting outwardly as though you never mattered, as though they were the ones who discarded you, and as though your existence is entirely irrelevant to their happiness. This display of apathy is not a sign of emotional maturity, closure, or genuine healing, but rather a theatrical defense mechanism. Inside, they are experiencing a severe ego wound because their inability to affect your emotional state exposes the hollow, impotent core of their grandiosity. By pretending not to care, they attempt to rewrite the emotional power dynamic, signaling to you, mutual acquaintances, and themselves that they hold the ultimate upper hand. They want you to believe that your silence had no impact on them, hoping that this feigned coldness will provoke a reaction or make you second-guess your decision to leave. It is a psychological shield designed to protect them from the terrifying truth that they are utterly replaceable and that their manipulation tactics have permanently failed. Recognizing this behavior for what it is helps dismantle any lingering doubts you might have during your recovery. When you see them acting completely unbothered, nonchalant, or aggressively happy on social media, remember that true indifference is quiet and effortless, whereas performed apathy is loud, targeted, and desperate. By maintaining your boundary and refusing to react to their manufactured facade, you deny them the final piece of validation they crave. This steadfast refusal forces them to carry the weight of their own unresolved emptiness, allowing you to walk away completely free from their psychological theater. The ultimate reason why prolonged no contact is so profoundly effective against a narcissistic individual lies in the very nature of what they require to sustain their psychological survival. Unlike secure individuals who draw their sense of self-worth from internal values, personal achievements, and genuine emotional connections, a narcissist depends entirely on an external framework of validation known as narcissistic supply. They treat other people as emotional mirrors, requiring a continuous stream of reactions, attention, compliance, and emotional turbulence to confirm that they exist and that they possess power. When you commit to prolonged, unbroken silence, you completely shatter this dynamic by denying them the mirror they desperately need to regulate their internal world. By cutting off all access to your emotions, your reactions, and your presence, you effectively starve their ego of the fuel it requires to maintain its grandiosity. In the absence of this supply, the narcissist is forced to face the terrifying, repressed void of their own internal emptiness, shame, and inadequacy, feelings their defense mechanisms are specifically designed to avoid at all costs. Because they cannot sustain a relationship with someone who refuses to feed their cycle of control and manipulation, the energy required to maintain the pursuit eventually outweighs the potential reward. When they realize that your boundary is permanent and impenetrable and that their surveillance, escalation, and hoovering tactics yield zero results, they are ultimately compelled to let go. Ultimately, prolonged no contact works because it removes you entirely from their board, making you a game they can no longer play. It denies them the satisfaction of knowing they still impact your nervous system, stripping away the power they once held over your life. While they may eventually redirect their toxic patterns toward easier targets who are willing to feed their perpetual need for validation, you are left standing in unshakable peace. By starving their supply and holding the line, you reclaim your autonomy, protect your mental health, and ensure that their cycle of dysfunction can never touch your reality again. As we pull back the curtain on the dark, predictable mechanics of what happens when you cut off a narcissist, one profound truth becomes entirely clear. Your silence is not just a boundary. It is a mirror, that reflects their deepest, most terrifying inadequacies. When you choose prolonged no contact, you step off a chaotic roller coaster designed to drain your spirit. You stop feeding an ego that views you not as a human being, but as an emotional fuel station. And while the aftermath can feel daunting, filled with covert surveillance, narrative rewriting, flying monkeys, and eventual calculated hoovering attempts, understanding this blueprint strips away their power. You realize that their rage is panic, their apathy is theater, and their outreach is nothing more than a starving ego searching for its next fix. You do not win against a narcissist by fighting them on their terms. You win by refusing to play the game altogether. By holding your boundaries firm, protecting your nervous system, and staying relentlessly silent, you force them to retreat into the hollow void of their own creation. Remember, healing isn't about waiting for them to change, apologize, or finally understand the pain they caused. It is about reclaiming your sovereignty, trusting your intuition, and stepping back into the light of a peaceful, unbothered life where their dysfunction can never reach you again. Keep your armor on, keep your peace protected, and step forward into your freedom.